Intestines, ruptured by saddle. On September 9th, 1087, King William I of England rode through the smoldering ruins of Mantes in France. The man who had conquered England 21 years earlier was leading a punitive raid against the French territories that bordered his domain. The town had been set ablaze on his orders, and buildings still burned as he surveyed the destruction from horseback. William was 60 years old by this point, heavy-set and overweight. His body had thickened considerably from decades of feasting and the sedentary life of a monarch. As he guided his horse through a narrow street lined with glowing embers and collapsed timber, the animal suddenly reared. The movement was violent and unexpected. The heavy iron pommel of his saddle was driven upward with tremendous force directly into his stomach. The impact was immediate and severe. William cried out in pain as the blow crushed his internal organs. His attendants rushed to help him down from the horse, but the damage was already done. The king's intestines had been ruptured by the blunt trauma. He was carried to the priory of Saint-Gervais in Rouen, where physicians attempted to treat the injury. There was nothing they could do. For 6 days, William lay in agony as infection spread through his abdominal cavity. The ruptured intestines leaked waste into his body, causing peritonitis. Fever consumed him. The pain was relentless. On September 9th, he finally died, but the horror did not end with his death. At his funeral in Caen, attendants attempted to place his corpse into a stone sarcophagus that had been prepared years earlier. William's body had swollen dramatically from the infection and decomposition. As the men tried to force the bloated remains into the too small coffin, pressure built against the decaying flesh. The corpse burst open, the abdomen split apart, releasing a wave of putrid gas and decomposed matter. The stench was so overwhelming that mourners fled the church immediately. Priests abandoned the ceremony. The smell lingered for days, a final indignity for the man who had once been called the Conqueror. Crossbow bolt infection. On April 6, 1199, Richard I of England stood outside the castle of Chalus-Chabrol in central France. The king, known as the Lionheart, was besieging the fortress over a dispute about a treasure supposedly found by a local peasant. It was a minor castle, barely worthy of royal attention, but Richard had come personally to oversee its capture. Late in the afternoon, the king decided to inspect the fortifications up close. He approached the castle walls without his chainmail, wearing only light protective gear. It was an act of casual confidence. Richard had fought in the Crusades, commanded armies across Europe, and survived countless battles. A small garrison in a rural French castle posed no real threat in his mind. On the ramparts above, a young man stood with a crossbow. Some accounts called him a boy, others a cook, pressed into defensive duty. He aimed the weapon at the king and released the bolt. It struck Richard in the left shoulder near the neck. The impact knocked him backward, but the wound appeared minor. The bolt had penetrated, but not deeply. Richard returned to his tent and ordered a surgeon to remove it. What followed was butchery disguised as medicine. The surgeon lacked proper tools and skill. He tore at the surrounding flesh, trying to extract the bolt, enlarging the wound significantly. By the time he finally pulled it free, the tissue was mangled and exposed. Within days, the signs of infection appeared. The wound turned red, then purple. Heat radiated from the puncture site. Gangrene began spreading through the damaged tissue, and the smell of rot became unmistakable. Fever overtook the king. His body fought the infection, but lost ground steadily. For 11 days, Richard deteriorated. On April 6th, his mother Eleanor of Aquitaine arrived to sit with him. He was conscious until the end, aware that his death was approaching. In his final hours, Richard ordered that the crossbowman be brought before him. He forgave the man and commanded his release. Shortly after, Richard the Lionheart died from an infection caused by a bungled arrow removal in a meaningless siege. Throat slit by rivals. On June 26, 1541, Francisco Pizarro was inside his palace in Lima, Peru. The conquistador who had toppled the Inca Empire now governed the territory he had claimed for Spain. He was 63 years old, wealthy beyond measure, but surrounded by enemies he had made during years of brutal conquest and political maneuvering. That Sunday afternoon, a group of armed men gathered outside his residence. They were supporters of Diego de Almagro II, son of Pizarro's former partner, whom Pizarro had ordered killed 3 years earlier. The group numbered around 20, armed with swords and daggers. They forced their way through the entrance, shouting threats and accusations. Pizarro heard the commotion from inside. He grabbed his sword and attempted to fasten his armor, but there was no time. The attackers were already rushing through the corridors. A handful of Pizarro's servants tried to hold them back, but were quickly overwhelmed. The old conquistador found himself facing armed assassins with only a partially buckled breastplate in his weapon. The fight was brief but fierce. Pizarro managed to kill 2 of the attackers, despite his age and disadvantage. courage. He fought with the skill that had carried him through decades of warfare, but he was outnumbered, and the years had slowed him. As he struggled to maintain his defense, one of the men lunged forward and drove a blade deep into his throat. The wound was immediately fatal. Blood poured from the severed vessels in his neck as Pizarro collapsed to the floor. He tried to speak, but could only manage gasps and choking sounds. His hands went to his throat, feeling the warm blood flowing between his fingers. In his final moments, Pizarro dipped his finger into his own blood and drew a crude cross on the stone floor beside him. He leaned down and kissed the symbol, calling out to Jesus Christ. Then he died on the floor of his palace, surrounded by the men who had come to avenge his betrayals. Hacked by Mactan warriors. On April 27, 1521, Ferdinand Magellan waded through shallow water toward the beach of Mactan Island in the Philippines. The Portuguese explorer commanded a force of around 60 Spanish soldiers in full armor. They were launching an amphibious assault against the native chieftain, Lapu-Lapu, who had refused to submit to Spanish authority or convert to Christianity. Magellan believed his European weapons and armor would guarantee victory against what he assumed were primitive fighters. He was wrong. As his men struggled through the knee-deep water in their heavy steel plates, more than 1,000 native warriors gathered on the beach ahead. They carried bamboo spears, scimitars, and bows with poisoned arrows. The battle began the moment Magellan's forces reached the shore. The natives attacked in waves, using their superior numbers and knowledge of the terrain. Magellan ordered his musketeers to fire, but the weapons proved nearly useless in the damp coastal conditions. Many failed to discharge. The crossbows were too slow to reload under sustained attack. Within minutes, the Spanish formation began to collapse. A poisoned arrow struck Magellan in the right leg, penetrating between the plates of his armor. The toxin worked quickly, weakening his mobility. He ordered his men to retreat slowly while he covered their withdrawal. The natives sensed his injury and focused their assault directly on him. A warrior rushed forward and struck Magellan's helmet with a scimitar. The blow knocked it partially off his head. Before he could adjust it, another strike hit him again, this time dislodging the helmet completely. Magellan was now exposed. A bamboo spear pierced his face, driving through his cheek. Blood poured from the wound. Surrounded and unable to defend himself effectively, Magellan fell to his knees. The warriors closed in with their bladed weapons. They hacked at him repeatedly with scimitars, cutting into his arms, legs, and torso. His men had already fled back to the boats, leaving him alone on the beach. Ferdinand Magellan died there in the surf, his body torn apart by multiple wounds as the tide washed around him. Forced seppuku amidst fire. On June 21, 1582, Oda Nobunaga was resting at the Honnoji Temple in Kyoto, Japan. The warlord had unified most of Japan through decades of military campaigns and political ruthlessness. He was 47 years old and traveled with only a small bodyguard of servants and attendants. The temple was supposed to be a safe place to stop during his journey. Just before dawn, 13,000 soldiers surrounded the compound. They were commanded by Akachi Mitsuhide, one of Nobunaga's most trusted generals. The betrayal was sudden and complete. Mitsuhide's forces moved quickly to seal every exit before launching their attack. Nobunaga woke to the sound of fighting as his guards attempted to hold the gates. He emerged from his chambers to assess the situation. The temple grounds were already overrun with enemy soldiers. His small force was hopelessly outnumbered. Nobunaga grabbed a bow and fought alongside his men, shooting arrows at the attackers flooding through the corridors. But the assault was overwhelming. Within minutes, most of his guards lay dead or dying. As the enemy pressed deeper into the temple complex, Mitsuhide's soldiers set the wooden buildings ablaze. Smoke began filling the interior spaces. Flames spread rapidly across the dry timber and paper walls. Nobunaga retreated further inside as the fire consumed the outer structures. He could hear enemy soldiers everywhere, shouting and searching for him. Nobunaga understood that escape was impossible. The temple was surrounded, burning, and his enemies would show no mercy if they captured him alive. He withdrew to an inner chamber and knelt on the floor. Following the samurai code, he chose to end his life on his own terms rather than face the dishonor of capture. He performed seppuku, cutting across his abdomen with a blade. The ritual disembowelment was swift. As he completed the act, flames engulfed the room around him. The fire consumed his body along with the rest of the temple. When Mitsuhide's men finally entered the smoldering ruins hours later, they found nothing identifiable. Oda Nobunaga's remains were reduced to ash, leaving no body to desecrate or display. Betrayed and decapitated. On September 28th, 48 BC, Pompey the Great stood on the deck of his warship anchored off the coast of Egypt. The Roman general had just lost a civil war against Julius Caesar at the Battle of Pharsalus. His army was destroyed, his political power gone, and he was fleeing for his life. Egypt seemed like his last hope for sanctuary. Pompey was 58 years old and had once been the most powerful man in Rome. He had conquered territories across the Mediterranean and commanded the loyalty of legions. Now he was a desperate refugee seeking protection from the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, who was only 15 years old at the time. From the shore, Egyptian officials appeared to welcome him. They sent a small boat rowed by several men, including a Roman officer named Lucius Septimius, who had once served under Pompey. The presence of a former subordinate seemed reassuring. Pompey's wife Cornelia and his advisors watched from the ship as he prepared to go ashore. Pompey climbed down into the small boat. He brought only 2 attendants with him. As the boat moved away from his ship toward the beach, he remained standing, reading a speech he had prepared in Greek to present to the young pharaoh. He was focused on the document, not paying attention to the men around him. When the boat was far enough from his ship that no one could intervene, the Egyptians attacked. Lucius Septimius drew his sword and stabbed Pompey in the back. The blade pierced between his ribs, driving deep into his organs. Pompey gasped and tried to turn, but the other men in the boat immediately joined the assault, stabbing him repeatedly. Pompey fell to his knees in the bottom of the boat. He pulled his toga over his face in a final gesture of Roman dignity, refusing to let his killers see his expression as he died. Within moments, he was dead from the multiple stab wounds. The assassins then drew a blade across his neck and severed his head completely. They threw his body onto the beach where it lay exposed in the sand, rotting under the Egyptian sun, while they took his head as proof to present to Caesar. Molten gold throat punishment. On December 25, 1553, Pedro de Valdivia faced his final battle at Tucapel in southern Chile. The Spanish conquistador governed the territory he had claimed for Spain through years of violent conquest. He commanded a force of exhausted soldiers who had been fighting continuous rebellions by the native Mapuche people. Leading the Mapuche warriors was Lautaro, a young man who had once served as Valdivia's personal page before escaping and joining the resistance. The ambush was carefully planned. Lautaro had learned Spanish military tactics during his time in captivity and used that knowledge against his former captors. As Valdivia's column marched through the forested terrain near Tucapel, thousands of Mapuche fighters attacked from multiple directions. The Spanish were quickly overwhelmed. Their horses became useless in the dense vegetation, and their formations broke apart under the coordinated assault. Valdivia was pulled from his horse and taken alive. The Mapuche had no intention of killing him quickly. They stripped him of his armor and bound him tightly. For hours, they inflicted a very uncomfortable time on the conquistador, beating him with clubs and fists. His face swelled, bones cracked, but he remained conscious throughout the ordeal. The Mapuche knew Valdivia's obsession with gold. He had spent years forcing indigenous people to extract precious metals from mines, enriching himself while native workers died from exhaustion and mistreatment. The warriors decided his end should reflect his greed. They built a fire and placed gold taken from Spanish camps into a container above the flames. When the metal reached a liquid state, glowing orange and unbearably hot, they forced Valdivia's mouth open. They poured the molten gold down his throat. The superheated liquid burned through his mouth, throat, and esophagus instantly. His internal tissues boiled and melted. He could not scream because the metal sealed his airway. Death came within seconds, but those seconds were filled with unimaginable agony. The ritual did not end there. The Mapuche cut open his chest and removed his heart while it was still warm. They consumed portions of it in a ceremony, believing they would absorb his strength and courage for future battles against the Spanish invaders. Burned alive in Cottage. On August 9th, 378 AD, Emperor Valens led the Eastern Roman army against the Visigoths near the city of Adrianople in modern-day Turkey. The emperor was 50 years old and had ruled for 14 years. He commanded an estimated 40,000 soldiers, one of the largest Roman forces assembled in decades. Valens believed his numerical advantage would guarantee victory against the Gothic tribes that had been raiding imperial territory. The battle began in the afternoon heat. Roman infantry advanced in tight formations toward the Gothic position, but they had marched all day without proper rest or water. The soldiers were exhausted before fighting even started. As the Romans engaged the Gothic foot soldiers, thousands of Gothic cavalry suddenly appeared on the horizon. They had been away foraging and returned at the perfect moment to strike the Roman flanks. The cavalry charge shattered the Roman lines completely. Soldiers trapped in the center of the formation were crushed together so tightly they could not raise their weapons. Panic spread rapidly. Units broke and ran in every direction. The organized Roman army dissolved into chaos within minutes. Tens of thousands of soldiers died on that field, cut down as they tried to flee. During the collapse, an arrow struck Emperor Valens. The wound was not immediately fatal, but it rendered him unable to fight or move quickly. His personal guards formed a protective circle and carried him from the battlefield. They brought him to a small peasant cottage nearby, hoping to hide him until the fighting ended and they could arrange safe transport. Inside the cottage, the guards barricaded the door and tended to the Emperor's wound. But Gothic cavalry units were sweeping across the area, searching buildings and killing any survivors they found. A group of riders surrounded the structure without knowing who was inside. They assumed it held Roman soldiers trying to hide. The Goths set fire to the cottage. Flames spread quickly across the thatched roof and wooden walls. Inside, Valens and his guards found themselves trapped. The door was blocked by debris and enemy forces outside. Smoke filled the small space within seconds. The Emperor died from smoke inhalation and burns as the building collapsed around him. His body was never recovered from the ashes, or identified among the charred remains.